real challenge we're going to face in our age is the divinity of Christ. Who is Jesus? Is he just a wonderful, kind person, a nice Galilean carpenter or builder or something that he was? Who is Jesus? A nice prophet, because some would have us believe that he was a very nice prophet and he said very nice things about God and encouraged us to be good people. The real question that every Christian must answer today is this: what do you believe about him? And when we preach the gospel, we do not just preach, come to Jesus and he will bless you. We have to be very clear about who this Jesus is. I'm Pastor Bola Ogedengbe, and this is Passion for God. One of the real questions we're faced with in our age is this: who is Jesus? You know, it's not enough for us to celebrate his birth or to celebrate his death and his resurrection. It's important for us to know who is Jesus. You know, a few years ago, after a time of prayer, the Lord began to minister to my heart, and I came to the understanding that the real challenge we're going to face in our age, we faced challenges about miracles, signs and wonders, the power of God in the past, but those are not the real challenges we're going to face in our age, even though there are sections of the church that are still adamantly opposed to anything that vaguely resembles the manifestation of the power of God. But that the real challenge we're going to face in our age is the divinity of Christ. Who is Jesus? Is he just a wonderful, kind person, a nice Galilean carpenter or builder or something that he was? Or was he what some people of his time called him, a Samaritan and a demon-possessed person? They actually said that about him, that he had a demon. Or is he the Jesus that many people in our generation like to follow, the nice, kind Jesus who didn't require anything of anyone, who taught very nice moral lessons, and who is just the Jesus for everybody, the one who never has anything negative to say about any lifestyle whatsoever, and who is the apostle of love, so long as you love one another, everything is okay. Who is Jesus? A nice prophet, because some would have us believe that he was a very nice prophet and he said very nice things about God and encouraged us to be good people, so that we can get along with everybody, so that we can all walk together in this wonderful world of religious harmony. Who is Jesus? The real question that every Christian must answer today is this: what do you believe about him? And when we preach the gospel, we do not just preach, come to Jesus and he will bless you. We have to be very clear about who this Jesus is. One American president, when he was expressing his support for a lifestyle that the Bible calls an abomination, said Jesus is love, that Jesus was in favor of love. I paraphrase what he had to say. And indeed, our generation, more than any, has been challenged about this. And unfortunately, too many Christians don't actually have a clear answer. Jesus had many things to say about himself. And the things that Jesus had to say about himself do not correspond to many of the things people are saying about him today. And so it's important for us to see this. I want us to look together in John chapter 5, because we're going to see a few of the things that Jesus had to say about himself. And if we have time, we will look at what other people said about him. One thing we know for sure is that the early apostles were absolutely convinced that he was not just a prophet. He was not just a good moral teacher. They were absolutely convinced that he was not this person who thought everything was fine so long as you believed in love, because God is love. They were absolutely convinced that he was not just a prophet, that he was the Son of God, and that he was God himself who became a human being. And that is why the Apostle John, in the first chapter of John, talks about the fact that he was God and he was with God and he became flesh. He was with God, he was God, and he became flesh. And he came among his own. And he was very clear in saying that everything that was created through him, attributed to him the role of creator of all that exists. So we know what his early disciples and apostles taught about him, what they taught and what they thought. But what did Jesus say about himself? Very often you will meet people who will tell you things about, well, Jesus never said that he was God. The interesting thing is that you cannot, in an honest way, look at the things that Jesus said about himself and not be convinced that he actually believed in his own divinity. But we will not try to push anything onto you or into his sentences. We will simply go through a series of 15 things that Jesus said about himself. Now let's look in John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, there is an issue here because people were not happy that Jesus was performing miracles on the Sabbath. And so that is the background to what we're going to read. And so in verse 16, it says that therefore the Jews began persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus responded to them, my Father is still working and I'm working also. This is why the Jews began trying all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Then Jesus replied, I assure you, the Son of Man is not able to do anything on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son also does these things in the same way. For the Father loves the Son and shows him everything he is doing, and he will show him greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. And just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so the Son also gives life to anyone he wants to. The Father, in fact, judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, so that all people will honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. Anyone who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. As I'm reading this, I want you to pay attention to the fact that this is Jesus standing as a human being in front of all of these other human beings, and he's saying these things about himself. If he had come there as an angel or even as some kind of shaft of light or some kind of majestic apparition, one would be tempted to say, okay, what is he saying? And incline one's ear in a different way. But he's standing there as a physical human being, and he's saying these things about himself. He's evoking a reality that is alien to anything that they understand. And we saw, as I began to read, that they were already reacting against this. Now, for all of the people who say that Jesus was just a nice prophet could not possibly say these kinds of things if they were not true. Now let's continue reading and then we'll break this apart. Remember, we're looking at 15 things that Jesus said about himself. I assure you, verse 24, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not come under judgment, but has passed from death to life. Jesus talking about himself. I assure you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. This is astonishing. For just as the Father has life in himself, so also he has granted to the Son to have life in himself. And he has granted him the right to pass judgment because he is the Son of Man. Do not be amazed at this, because the time is coming when all who are in the graves would hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good things to the resurrection of life, but those who have done wicked things to the resurrection of judgment. I can do nothing on my own. I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is righteous because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. My judgment is righteous. Now, verse 31, it says, if I testify about myself, my testimony is not valid. There is another who testifies about me, and I know that the testimony he gives about me is valid. You have sent messengers to John, and he has testified to the truth. I don't receive man's testimony, but I say these things so that you may be saved. John was a burning and shining lamp, and for a time you were willing to enjoy his light. But I have a greater testimony than John's because of the works that the Father has given me to accomplish. These very works I am doing testify about me that the Father has sent me. The Father who sent me has himself testified about me. You have not heard his voice at any time, and you haven't seen his form. You don't have his word living in you because you don't believe the one he sent. You pore over the scriptures because you think you have eternal life in them, yet they testify about me. And you are not willing to come to me so that you may have life. Now, what Jesus is saying here about himself is absolutely Astonishing. Verse 41, let's continue. I do not accept glory from men, but I know you, that you have no love for God within you. I have come in my Father's name, yet you don't accept me. If someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe while accepting glory from one another? You don't seek the glory that comes from the only God. Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, because he wrote about me. But if you don't believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So we see that these people had all kinds of ideas about Jesus. And when you read the Gospel of John, it's really amazing to see how much conflict he had with all these religious leaders and different people who accused him. Sometimes there were times when they said he was insane and all kinds of crazy things that they said about him, because they were conscious of the impact of his words in a way that we are not today. Or perhaps we don't even read what he actually said about himself and think through the implications of what he said about himself. Now, the first thing I'm going to pick out in this passage that Jesus said about himself, remember there are 15 things in all, and I hope we'll get through them all, is this. He speaks of himself as being, in a sense, as being identical. He speaks of a sort of identicality between him and the Father. He called God his Father, and they got so upset with him. They said he was making himself equal with God. You see, we just read these things today, and they don't make that much sense to us. But the people who understood it realized that he was actually claiming equality with God. It says that they began to persecute him because of what he was doing on the Sabbath. But then he said his Father was working, he was working. So he equates himself with God, God's activity, his activity, justifying his right to work on the Sabbath. In other words, you cannot accuse God of breaking the Sabbath. You cannot accuse me of breaking the Sabbath. And then not only was he breaking the Sabbath, they said he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So in their understanding, his portrayal of God, not only as the Father of the Jewish nation, but as his Father, is tantamount to making himself equal with God. He knew it and they knew it. And so they wanted to kill him because they were incensed. And so he continued to say this. He said, whatever the Father does, the Son also does these things in the same way. So there's an identicality of purpose, of action, and of volition between him and the Father. The second thing that he said about himself is that he claimed to give life. He claimed to possess life in himself. This is a very clear claim to divinity. Only God has life. And the Apostle John, when he wrote about him, he said that in him was life, that life was in him. Only God has life in him, and only God can give life. And he says, I assure you, an hour is coming, is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Life will come into them because they hear his voice. He says in verse 26, for just as the Father has life in himself, so also he has granted to the Son to have life in himself. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. And just before he brought Lazarus back from the dead, he said this. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. Only God has life. The third thing he says about himself in this passage is this. He said that he was the judge. He was going to be the one to judge all men. Now, he says the Father, in fact, judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, so that all people will honor the Son just as they honor the Father. In Matthew 25, in verse 31, he says this. This is powerful. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him. Now, Jesus is claiming that he's going to return, and angels are going to come with him. No prophet ever said that. Then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, just as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. This is Jesus claiming divinity, that he was coming back as the judge of the world, and all the nations will be before him, and he will be the one to make a separation between them, and he will be the judge. The fourth thing he says about himself in this passage is that he claims the same honor that the Father has. What does he say? He says, all the people will honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Now, who will have the temerity to say such a thing? He is claiming that he will receive the same honor that God the Father is receiving. The fifth thing he says about himself is that the scriptures testify about him. Now, we know the scriptures tell stories about different kinds of people, but he actually claims here that they testify about him. In other words, they validate his claims. They validate who he says that he is. He says, you are spending your time devouring the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, but they testify about me. And yet you are not willing to come to me so that you may have life. Do you see what he's saying here? He's not just saying that the scriptures tell my story the way they told the story of David or the story of Solomon or the story of Elijah or Elisha or what have you. But he's saying that there is a testimony of him in the scripture that should push these people to come to him to receive life. So that testimony of him in the scriptures is not a testimony of him as some nice prophet. It's a testimony of him as the Son of God. The sixth thing that Jesus said about himself that we're going to look at is in John chapter 14. In John chapter 14, this is a powerful passage. Verse 8, it says this, Lord, said Philip, show us the Father. This is one of my favorite passages. So Philip has been following Jesus. He's been seeing him doing great and amazing things, but his mindset cannot quite grasp the reality of who Jesus was. Now, remember, this is after Peter had said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and all those wonderful things. But this is why we need to understand that when the early apostles came to the realization that he truly was God made flesh, it was a major shift for them. It wasn't something they sat down and invented because it was very alien to their thinking. And after all the time he had spent with Jesus, Philip now says, Lord, show us the Father, and that's enough for us. And it sounds really spiritual, doesn't it? Jesus said to him, listen carefully, have I been among you all this time without you knowing me, Philip? The one who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I speak to you, I do not speak on my own. The Father who lives in me does his works. As Christians, we're used to reading this, and it doesn't shake us up the way it should. What Jesus is saying to him here is that if you have seen me, you don't need to see the Father. He says, the Father and I, it's really astounding. He says, I've been with you all this time and you don't know. He's making it clear to Philip that Philip should have realized who he was. And that if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. And then he says, how can you say, show us the Father? Like, Philip, come on. You still don't understand? He says, don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? You know, we're believers and he's in us, but we're not in him. And the fact that he's in Christ, Christ is in him, is proof of his divinity. And so he says, he is the one who does the works that I do. Another thing that Jesus says, and I almost quoted that too early, about himself, and that's point number 7, is he says that he speaks of his unity and oneness with the Father. In John chapter 10, verse 29, he says this, my Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hands. The Father and I are one. He's not saying that we are one person. He's saying we are one entity, because he uses the neutral form in the Greek and not the masculine form, which means we're one entity, we're one essence, we're one. Again, the Jews picked up rocks to stone him. You realize they knew the import of what he was saying. Now, when you see people say, where did Jesus say he is God? These fellows knew that was what he was saying. That's why they wanted to stone him. It's sheer ignorance for someone today to say that Jesus never claimed to be God. He did. All of these passages, that's what he's claiming. And so the father and I are one. Again, the Jews picked up rocks to stone him. Jesus replied, listen to this. Jesus replied, I have shown you many good works from the Father. Which of these are you stoning me for? Listen to what they said to him. These are people who had understanding. We aren't stoning you for a good work, the Jews answered, but for blasphemy. Because you, being a man, make yourself God. So what they saw was a man, but they understood that the things he was saying meant that he saw himself as God. And they said, we're going to kill him. They said, you being a man, make yourself God. The next time someone says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, read them this passage. They obviously do not understand the implications of the things that he was saying about himself. Now, all of this is extremely important, and in our day, people will call him many things. Some people even call him a Western imperialist, because in the myopic culture in which we live, you have a lot of young people in the West who have a self-destructive tendency to obliterate everything that has made the greatness of Western civilization, including and beginning with Christianity. But what they do not realize is this, and it is a form of hubris really, because they seem to think that Christianity is the white man's religion, which is not. It is not, because Jesus was not a Westerner. He came from the Middle East, and it's not the West that's dominating the East with Christianity, or the West dominating the rest of the world with Christianity. It's rather the Middle East, Jesus from the Middle East, who came and took over the West with, that's a way of speaking. That's more political than anything else. But there's no culture war here. Christianity is not involved in a culture war with anybody. It's not the religion of dominant white people who are pushing it on dark-skinned people all over the world. That is a very ridiculous point of view. It's a very silly perspective from people who are completely locked up in a one-world vision of things and have no understanding of the origin of Christianity. And so it's very important for us as believers, especially third-world believers, to claim Christ as ours. And he's not the fruit of Western imperialism. He's not the tool of Western imperialism. And he's not a white man who is oppressing us and destroying our cultures. No, Jesus was born in the Middle East. And not only was he born in the Middle East, he's for all nations, he's for all peoples. And they understood that what he was saying here was that he was God, and they wanted to kill him for it. And so it's very important for us to be very clear about where we stand and forget all the images of the white Jesus. That is every culture appropriates for himself. When you go to certain parts of the world, you will see Jesus, portrayed as a black person. It doesn't mean that he was black, but different cultures do their own cultural appropriation. The eighth thing I'm going to say about Jesus that he said about himself is that he had the power to forgive sins. Now, only God can forgive sins, but Jesus claimed the power to forgive sins. When they brought the paralytic to him in the house in Capernaum, the first thing he said to him was, son, your sins are forgiven. And if you think this was a normal thing, then you haven't read the passage, because in the passage, the people there were really shocked. All the religious leaders were like, well, who's this man? They were grumbling within themselves. He thinks he has the power to forgive sins. So it wasn't what you would normally expect a prophet to say or a rabbi to say. It was only Jesus who was able to say that, because he truly had the power to forgive sins. And then the next thing I would draw our attention to that Jesus said about himself comes from John chapter 8, verse 49. He claimed to be able to preserve from death. What does that mean? In John 8:49, he said, I do not have a demon, because they were accusing him of having a demon. Jesus answered, on the contrary, I honor my Father and you dishonor me. So I do not seek my glory. The one who seeks it also judges. I assure you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death, ever. Then the Jews said, now we know you have a demon. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. You say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death, ever. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? Even the prophets died. Who do you pretend to be? Who do you think you are? You're saying if anyone follows you, they would not see death? You know, I love these passages because the indignation of the people he was speaking to is a clear indication of the weight of the words that he was speaking, of the significance of the things that he was saying, which is often lost on us today because of familiarity. The 10th thing that Jesus said about himself is that he claimed to be glorified by God the Father, to be eternal, and he assumed the I am name of God. He says, for instance, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. My Father, you say about him, he is our God. He is the one who glorifies me. Do you see what he's saying? He says, you claim God. You claim my Father as your God. But it is your God who glorifies me. And which human being talks like that? It is he who glorifies me. You have never known him, but I know him. If I were to say I don't know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him and I keep his word. Your father Abraham was overjoyed that he would see my day. He saw it and rejoiced. The Jews replied, you aren't 50 years old yet and you've seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, I assure you, listen to this. Before Abraham was, I am. And the 11th thing that he said about himself was that he claimed pre-existence. He claimed that he existed before the world even existed. In John chapter 17, verse 5, he was talking to the Father. He said, now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world existed. This is Jesus. He is saying that he existed before the world existed and that he had glory with the Father before the world existed. The 12th thing he said about himself is this. He claims to be the way, the truth, and the life. And he says nobody comes to the Father except through him. We know this passage, don't we? But John 14:23 says, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. My Father will love him and we will come to him and make our home with him. So Jesus is saying that Father and I, we are together. We will come and make our home in a person. If he was just a human being, how could he make his home in a person? But he's expressing his divinity in the fact that he and the Father together will come and make their home in a person. And you know the passage I mentioned earlier, John 14:6, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. What did Jesus say about himself? 13th point. He claimed that what you feel about him is what you feel about God. Isn't that amazing? John 15:23, he says this, the one who hates me also hates my Father. Now, I can't say that. You can hate me and not hate God. But Jesus says if you hate him, then you hate the Father. In other words, as we've already read, he and the Father are one. Whatever you feel about Jesus is what you feel about. That is a claim to divinity if there was any. The 15th point I'm going to give you, and this is not all he said about himself, but we're limiting ourselves to 15. The 15th thing I'm going to tell you that Jesus said about himself is that he answers prayers. Only God can answer prayers. In John 14:13, he says, whatever you ask the Father in my name, I will do it. Whatever you ask the Father in my name, I will do it. And so Jesus says these things about himself. But twice in his story, we see the Father speak from heaven and testify concerning him. In Matthew 3:17, it says, a voice came from heaven. This is my beloved Son. I take delight in him. In Matthew 17:5, it says, while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son. I take delight in him. Listen to him. And people were like, what happened? It thundered, and all kinds of strange things. So he spoke about himself. He claimed divinity. The Father spoke about him. And the people who followed him spoke about him. What did they say about him? In John chapter 1, the Apostle John writes this amazing passage that we all know and we all love. And he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him. And apart from him, not one thing was created that had been created. And so he calls him the creator. And then he goes on to say that this creator now became flesh. Only God is creator, and he claims that Jesus is creator. The second thing I want to point out is this, that the Apostle John says in 1 John 2, verse 23, no one who denies the Son can have the Father. He who confesses the Son has the Father as well. Once again, oneness between the Father and the Son. In Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, and we're going to conclude with that. Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. These are expressions of divinity. And I'll just conclude by saying this. Let us celebrate Christ. Let us worship him. But let us know who we are celebrating and who we are worshiping. Faithfulness to the biblical revelation of Christ is more than ever essential. This is the bedrock of the Christian faith. This is why we are Christians. Because God became flesh and took upon himself our sins and went to that cross, was crucified, died, was buried, and rose from the dead. This is the gospel. Not that a nice moral teacher or a prophet died for us, but that God himself became flesh. We cannot negotiate on these things. These are vital components of the Christian faith. This is the essence of the Christian faith. And there are parts of the world today where people are put to death because they believe this. We all need courage in these times, and in particular in the West, where it has become very common to prevaricate on these matters and to think that tolerance means denying truth. Tolerance is not denying truth, because when we deny truth to be popular, we forsake Christ and we condemn men to an eternity without God. You know, there are many who have given their lives for the truth of Christ to be known and to be heard. It behooves us not only to know him, but to live for him, to preach him, to proclaim him as the Son of God and as God made flesh. God bless you and shalom.